Hi guys, welcome to this tutorial on Exposure by Wilfred Owen. This poem is part of AQA's Power and Conflict poetry anthology, and in this session we're going to just look through some of the key ideas, themes, elements of language, elements of structure around this poem, and maybe just start thinking about the connections and links we might make to other poems. Now, in terms of key context, important stuff for us to think about is the fact that obviously Wilfred Owen was a soldier in World War I. He experienced, conflict in a very personal manner, and therefore he's writing from a kind of uniquely personal perspective with some of his poems. And he, like many World War I soldiers, becomes increasingly disillusioned with the war effort, the purpose of him being there, and I think that sentiment is really, really evident in a number of the poems of Owen, including Exposure. Now, as some of you may know, Wilfred Owen dies a handful of days really before Armistice Day, and really tragically that these poems are taking on a poignancy because he lost his life fighting for his country. So I've put some key context stuff here at the top, and I don't intend to go through all of those elements, but these are things that you could perhaps do a bit of your own research and thinking about. So exposure, linking to hypothermia in terms of that's a medical condition. The salient, thinking about literally military structure and kind of the geography of the battlefields. Thinking about some pastoral and rural issues around England, and then around trench warfare. You can see there some key terms which I will try to remember to refer to as I go through the poem. Okay, so thinking about the title Exposure, this is polysemic, which means it's a word that has two meanings, and you'll find actually polysemic language throughout the anthology. In this instance, it's referring to the idea that there's really two enemies that these soldiers faced. You've got, yes, the enemy, the Germans across no man's land at the other side of the battlefield, but equally the weather is as much of an enemy towards the soldiers as actually the Germans were. So you kind of got two sort of things that this refers to. And in actual fact, as I've made in my notes here, really there's a third enemy faced by these soldiers, which is their exposure to the incompetence, the poor management, the mismanagement, in terms of those people that are in charge, these people who are saying, walk, don't run across battlefields, because that's not how the British do it. Sending tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of young men to their deaths. So let's look at this first stanza. I'm going to work on the assumption that you've read the poem yourself first. But I think what's important is we start with this collective pronoun, our brains ache. And actually look as you go through the poem for the number of times Owen uses collective pronouns. He feels very much part of a team. The soldiers are in it together, facing enemies together as units. And so we have this sense of our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. And this is a really key quote, one of, when you're doing your revision cards or you're thinking about key quotes to remember. You've got a number of devices and techniques in here. There's an intensity to that image of the iced east winds, and some of that is created there through the iced east. You've got these kind of sibilant sounds, the merciless ice east winds. So we've also got an example here of personification. The wind is given an identity and a life and a humanity that feels like it's a real enemy that knives us. And so this also connotes in some ways to bayonets, the knives, the blades on the end of guns, and it reminds us that soldiers could die excruciating deaths, from being stabbed with bayonets, but equally the weather itself, if they get hypothermia, could end up killing them. So yeah, you've got this image, and then you've got this ellipsis, this pause that knives, ... and it's just this kind of pause, this waiting around. The soldiers have nothing to do but wait. And so my computer went really weird there. we get this imagery here about the tired soldiers waiting. We get here an example of slant rhymes where we've got kind of silent, salient. So there's some similarity there. Sometimes they're called half rhymes, and it really kind of emphasizes this sort of unspecified length of time. The night is silent, the memory of the salient. They're quite long vowel sounds as well. But these soldiers are keeping awake. They're remembering what it was like on the front line. So we're thinking of sort of Battle of the Bulge, the Battle of the Somme. Worried by silence. It seems an unusual thing to be afraid of, but these soldiers are on such edge. They are so traumatized by the things they've seen that silence is no longer peaceful. It's they're just waiting for the next attack, onslaught, whatever it might be. And so even something like silence, which could be comforting, they're on edge and they're anxious. And that's reinforced, isn't it, with the idea of these adjectives here about being curious and nervous. You'll notice the refrain, but nothing happens. And this is used a number of times within the poem to emphasize that although they're on edge and frightened, at this point in their experience, nothing is happening. They're not fighting, they're not going over the top. But it's only a matter of time until they do, and they're just in this holding pattern, this sort of purgatory of sorts, waiting for, to fight, waiting to die. I've made a note here in the key terms about the synaesthesia. This means when something is multi-sensory, it's not just what you can see, it's you can hear, you can feel, and we get evidence of that within this stanza. They're watching, but they're also hearing things. And in this case, this sense of the men waiting, hearing the weather that surrounds them, and we get this simile of like the twitching agonies of men among its brambles. We get this image of the wire, the barbed wire that would be on the, across no man's land, and we get this graphic imagery of men, tangled up in this barbed wire as could have happened and did happen. The brambles here evokes images of an English pastoral landscape, autumn with blackberries and brambles. But actually in this, the imagery is far more unpleasant, isn't it? It's the dying agony of injured soldiers tangled in that barbed wire. They can hear in the distance incessantly, and that adverb incessantly conveys the sense that there's no end, there's no respite to the noise of war that surrounds them. And in that kind of, we get the assonance here of the gunnery rumbles, and it kind of almost mimics that gunfire sounds. The gunnery rumbles, it's a assonance used there to create that particular effect. So they can hear in the distance the sound of warfare. And this simile is interesting. It's like a dull rumour of another war. It doesn't feel real to them. They know it's there, but it's unreal as they're there in this holding pattern. And the rhetorical question used here, what are we doing here, is significant because it's, what are we doing here in this trench, in this camp a mile away from the front line, freezing to death? But there's a bigger sort of philosophical point about literally why are we there? Why are we fighting? What are we doing here? What's the bigger purpose of this war? So we get this imagery of dawn coming, and ironically, dawn is described as the poignant misery of dawn. And dawn normally evokes hope, it's the beginning of a new day, but here, dawn, each new day is just more misery upon misery. And these soldiers, the only information, they're given no real information about strategy, what's happening. The only thing they know is that this war goes on and on. And I like this conjunction of the war lasts and the rain soaks. It reminds us of normal things like rain versus something abnormal and horrific such as war. And we then get these, again, more assonant vowels, heavy, slow rhythm, they're sag, they're stormy. So they this image of a miserable, wintry, cold day. And then here, through this sort of personification of the weather, very military in terms of the sort of semantic field here. The dawn is massing her melancholy army, attacks once more in ranks, on shivering ranks of grey. So we get the idea of this is actually metaphors for the weather, which is clearly building up rain clouds, storm clouds, and attacking the soldiers. So a bit like Storm on the Island, we've got these kind of subtle references to conflict with the weather. In the same way, Storm on the Island, you get the exploding comfortably, the bombarded, the strafes. The grey is interesting. Obviously, the weather is literally grey, but also it evokes images of the German uniform. And then that refrain again, but nothing happens. So looking into the fourth stanza, the suddenness of living in this uncertain war zone is evoked here through the sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence. And clearly the sibilance there evokes that speed and suddenness of an attack. I think this is open to your interpretation. Are these bullets real, or they're referring to hail and storm conditions? And interestingly, if we perceive these to be real bullets, it's interesting that these are seen by the soldiers as less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow, with flowing flakes that flock, pause and renew. So to these soldiers, a mile or so behind the front line, actually the weather is a more imminent danger to them than the actual bullets. But yes, okay, so we get these fricatives. Fricatives are like those F sounds, flakes, flowing flakes that flock. They're quite soft consonants, and that contrasts quite effectively with the harshness of war. There's a soothing, gentle, almost seductive tone to the snowflakes, and all the soldiers can do is watch them. And you see, the weather's presented here in a kind of meandering fashion, as though there's a casual, laid-back confidence to weather. Weather is not dictated to by war or, what's going on in the lives of humans. Weather is just weather. And a bit like with, thinking about poems like Storm on the Island, poems like Prelude, poems like Ozymandias, we get that sense of nature's dominance and its power. And here it's oblivious, as in the notes, to the deeds of human beings. And again, nothing still happens. But this imagery of the weather kind of attacking and being vindictive, almost vicious, is reinforced into stanza 5, where the pale flakes, the fingering stealth, come feeling for our faces, and that fricative sound again. It's this image of the soldiers they're freezing to death. And I find this next image very emotional, actually. We cringe in holes, back on Forgotten Dreams. And there's something about the verb cringe to me that just shows how powerless the soldiers were. They're in holes, they're not in well-prepared barracks. They're, these trenches filled with snow and filth. And there's something animalistic and inhumane in it. And it conveys the helplessness and also anger and frustration that those people in charge have not provided safe or hygienic spaces for the soldiers. And in this stanza, which is quite complex in some ways, we get the sense of the soldiers here, suffering from hypothermia, potentially hallucinating, which is a side effect of hypothermia. And they're reminded of this pastoral England, although that being said, even when they think about grassier ditches back home, the ditches remind us of the trenches. And so sun-dozed, we drowse sun-dozed, littered with blossoms trickling where the blackbird fusses. You've got these very natural, comforting images of home, of spring, with blossom and birds in hedges, and these kind of images of life and spring and home are really juxtaposing with the bleak reality of their lives in the trenches. And it's highly likely that these images are coming from a place of the extreme hypothermia that the soldiers are facing. Okay, so looking at onto our next page then, we see the soldiers here. We've got this image of slowly our ghosts drag home. And again, some complexity to this stanza. around, are the ghosts of dead soldiers going home, or is it just that part of them has died and they cast their memories back, but these are now, they're kind of the walking dead, and they drag home. It sense that verb has a sense of difficulty towards that returning home, but they see in their mind's eye, briefly glimpsing fires, glazed, it's just an archaic term for glazed, with crusted dark red jewels. So we've got comforting images of warm fires, of insects in hedgerows, and so it's a very sort of comforting image of home and safety, but also has some sort of darker overtones, really. The house is theirs. These houses the soldiers are coming from are now deserted. The shutters and doors are all closed. On us, the doors are closed. It could mean a couple of things. The reality is that the soldiers can't return home. They can think about it. They can return home in their minds. But at the moment, they are trapped on this, hell battlefield experience that they're going through. It could also, and this reminds me of Kamikaze, on us the doors are closed, and I wonder if there's focusing on the expectation put upon soldiers. You go, you fight for your country, and you either return as a hero when the war ends, or you return dead. And so I think there is a focus there on that. And I've just made this point here about the anastrophe, which is a technique where you change around your word order to emphasize something a bit differently. So you might normally say, the doors are closed on us, but on us the doors are closed. It just changes slightly the emphasis, and it's just something to consider. So our last line on this stanza is about, we turn back to our dying. And I've circled our because just as a reminder again about these collective pronouns, these viewing themselves as a team. So penultimate stanza really focuses on, and it's possibly one of the hardest stanzas to think about, but it's, and again the word order is slightly unusual. Since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn, not ever suns smile true on child or field or fruit. I think really what we're looking at here is a sense of there's a lost, this stanza really focuses on lost trust, lost hope, lost faith in God, lost faith in a future, and they can't even believe that this reality at home with warm fires and sunshine and children and all these innocent and beautiful images, they can hardly believe that these exist. That reality is so far gone. And for God's invincible spring, our love is made afraid. I think this focuses on the sort of experience of many soldiers where they question, is there a God? Can there be a God when we're suffering in such a way? And really reinforced in this, for love of God seems dying. I think this raises some interesting questions. Is it their love of God seems to be dying, or is it the love of God for his people dying? Some complex ideas around the loss of faith. Now, the last stanza then brings us right to the present, so that it positions us here tonight. This frost will fasten. And I think about there's a certainty to this sort of future tense. The frost will fasten on this mud and us. And again, that word order where us is positioned at the end is interesting. So it feels like there is a real inevitability to what's going to happen to these soldiers, shriveling many hands, puckering foreheads crisp. And so we get again some graphic and unpleasant images about what the exposure to the elements could do physically to people. They sound, their bodies sound deformed and damaged. And we get this sense of the burying party, picks and shovels in shaking grasp, paws over half-known faces. So we get these, tools being used, practical tools being used, but within the shaking grasp, the grasp of these tools it's shaking because they're cold. Is it shaking because of grief? Unclear. But these people going out and picking up the dead bodies, pause over half-known faces. So, you know, they're half-known. Is this because they have now become so physically deformed, or is it just because they kind of recognise them? Either way, it's a horrific task for these soldiers to do. Go around, you know, who's died in the night, who do we need to bury from our team, from our unit? These are possibly friends, and you know, people they're fighting and serving alongside. And this sort of penultimate line, all their eyes are ice. There's an interesting shift here in pronouns, because is this now talking about the eyes of the dead bodies? You know, on a literal sense, people have died, their eyes have kind of glazed over as happens in death and become more opaque. But is it talking about the burying party? Their eyes are ice. You know, they have to take on a coldness, they have to take on a detachment because of their job. And concluding the poem, we get this sort of cyclical structure of the refrain, but nothing happens. You know, day in, day out, soldiers are dying, yes, on the front line, but equally they're dying unnecessarily of exposure, freezing conditions. Interestingly, I'm doing this tutorial on the 11th of November, and it's very evocative to me. In fact, I've just got my badge there, you can see it, I've got my poppy on. But it's, you know, really reinforces that kind of sacrifice and loss. Just for some of you who might be interested, extra reading, Futility, also by Wilfred Owen, is a really good poem that conveys many of the similar themes. Now, in terms of what you might wish to link this to in an exam situation, it works particularly well with any of the kind of soldier war-based poems. So you could link it in a modern context to Remains. You could link it to Kamikaze in terms of treatment of soldiers. More complex, but you could easily do that. I think that this works really well with Bayonet Charge, because you've almost got soldiers at 2 points. Soldiers behind the, you know, well behind the front line, and then in Bayonet Charge, that experience of going over the top, very much in that active battle zone. You can talk about this in connection to Charge of the Light Brigade, really nice connections there. And again, you can look at the kind of appalling military decisions that result in the kind of needless deaths of soldiers. I'm trying to think if there was anything else I might refer it to. I mean, these are very much obviously in terms of war and soldiers. You can obviously, excuse me, you can obviously look at this in terms of, that says weather, sorry, terrible handwriting today. And so it works well against something like Storm on the Island. You can talk about the power of nature in something like Prelude, in Ozymandias. Anything else weather-based? Just thinking, top of my head, should have thought about this before. I think these would be, and then maybe, I've written Prelude. I had a thought of something else, but I've forgotten now. And so I think these are the best poems to sort of link in terms of war or weather. Okay, I hope this proved useful, and yeah, talk to you soon. Bye.